This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
You've probably heard the term scientific socialism, right? And you immediately think of Karl Marx. But here's a thought. What if the most important word there isn't socialism? What if it's scientific? Because what that word meant back in the 19th century, well, it's not what you think. And honestly, it changes everything.
So whenever we talk about Marx, the conversation always, and I mean always, boils down to one thing. Was he right? Did his big predictions actually happen? And look, that's a totally fair question to ask, but it might just be the wrong question.
Why is it the wrong question? Well, because if we only focus on whether the predictions came true, we completely miss what was driving the whole thing in the first place. Think of it this way. It's like judging a car based on where it ended up, without ever popping the hood to see what kind of engine was supposed to get it there.
See, the real key, the secret to its incredible persuasive power, is all hidden in that one little word, scientific. And here's the twist. Back in the 19th century, that word meant something, well, completely different from what we mean when we say scientific today.
Okay, so to really get what they meant, we have to look at a German word, Wissenschaftlich. Now, back then, being scientific had nothing to do with lab coats or test tubes. No, it was all about creating a huge systematic theory, like a master blueprint that could logically explain the entire world, all as one single interconnected system.
And right there, you can see the huge difference. Today, when we say science, we're talking about experiments, evidence, things you can observe and test. Trying to prove your own ideas wrong. But the Wissenschaftlich way? That was all about pure conceptual logic. If your system was perfectly consistent on its own terms and could explain everything from A to Z, that's what made it scientific. It didn't need outside proof.
So who was the absolute master of this kind of thinking? The guy who basically wrote the book on it. A philosopher named Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. He's the one who created the ultimate template for looking at all of history in this Wissenschaftlich way. And Hegel's model was honestly pretty brilliant. He argued that history isn't just one random thing after another. Nope, it follows a clear, predictable, logical pattern. It goes like this. First, you have some stage of history, let's say an ancient empire. Then, step 2, inside that empire, tensions and contradictions start to bubble up. And finally, step 3, those contradictions get so big they shatter the old system and something new and more advanced is born from the ashes. And then, the whole cycle starts over again. Now for Hegel, what was the engine driving this whole historical machine? It was something pretty abstract, something philosophical that he called spirit, or Geist in German. This was the idea of human reason, of consciousness itself, always moving forward, always marching towards a higher and higher state of understanding. Okay, and this is where Karl Marx comes back into the picture. He looked at Hegel's powerful, logical, Wissenschaftlich template for history and thought, wow, this is genius. He thought the structure, the whole 3-step process, was absolutely perfect. But he was completely convinced Hegel had the wrong engine. So Marx did something really clever. He basically performed a swap. He kept Hegel's entire system, that whole historical template, but he pulled out the abstract engine of spirit and replaced it with something very real, very tangible, economic production, the material world and the struggle between social classes. And with this new engine plugged in, Marx laid out his own stages of history. Feudalism, he said, had its own internal contradictions that inevitably gave birth to capitalism. And now, while capitalism has its contradictions, that struggle between the owners and the workers, and that struggle will, he argued, inevitably give birth to socialism. You see how persuasive that is? It's not presented as just an opinion. It's framed as the logical, unavoidable outcome of a scientific system. But this is where we run into the really fundamental problem. And it isn't just an issue with Marx or even with Hegel. It's a problem with the very idea of this kind of grand, all-explaining system itself. Look, a system can be perfectly logical. It can be totally, internally consistent. It can look back at the past and explain everything with this beautiful clarity where every single piece fits together like a perfect puzzle. But, and this is a huge but, just because it's logical doesn't mean it's true. Logical consistency is not the same thing as being right about the real world. And that leads us to the most critical jump in logic. You can build a really compelling story that explains how we got from the past to the present, from point A to point B. But taking that same pattern, projecting it into the future, and declaring that the next step is inevitable, well, that's a massive leap of faith. That's when your historical theory stops being a theory and starts being a prophecy. This really brings us full circle, back to our modern idea of what science is, right? A modern scientific forecast, whether it's in economics or climate science or whatever, it always deals in probabilities, in possibilities. It's a hypothesis you test. But scientific socialism? It presented its conclusions not as a maybe, but as an absolute, unbreakable law of history. So, where does all this leave us? If asking "was Marx right" is the wrong question, then what's the right question we should be asking?
I think the real lesson here, the most important takeaway from scientific socialism, isn't about getting the future right or wrong. It's about understanding why these kinds of systems are so incredibly appealing in the first place. This idea that you've cracked the secret code of history. That Wissenschaftlich method, that grand story that explains everything, it's just so powerful that it can make one person's interpretation of the past feel like an absolute, undeniable blueprint for what has to happen next.
And that, of course, leaves us with one final question to think about. Because this way of thinking, it didn't just vanish in the 19th century. Far from it. So what are the grand, inevitable stories that we believe today? What narratives, coming from all sides of the spectrum, tell us that a certain future is the guaranteed outcome of our present? It's a really good reminder to always question the blueprint.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.